As Jeff said, I'm one of the people who set up the charity Zero Carbon Guildford, which deals with a number of things from retrofit to river water testing, got a community fridge, running the Surrey Sustainable Business Network. And then it's actually been about 2.5 years now. I've been the engagement lead at Surrey County Council. Part of that job being to try and bridge the gap between councils and communities. Obviously, they don't always have the best working relationship, which is a shame because, I think both sides acknowledge that we need to really have like unprecedented collaboration to tackle some of the challenges we've got. So, in a way, that's how I sort of see my role at work. So, I deal with engagement. I lead on engagement at the council across the Greener Futures Group, which is strategic energy, climate change, natural environment, and grant delivery for like sustainable grants for businesses. So my job is quite focused on what we're going to talk about tonight. Obviously, as we saw from the start there, lots of people across SECA run lots of really great projects, lots of community energy themed projects, be it generation, energy champion or energy doctor style projects or open houses. So what I don't want to do is come and teach anyone how to suck eggs. That's not really the point of this evening. There's loads of people who know at least or way more than me about setting some of these up, who I'm sure you can go to for specific advice on how some of these things work and how you can learn from what they've done. So the point more this evening is to try and emphasize some tricks and tips and removing some barriers that you can apply to any one of these projects that involves energy, be it generation or energy efficiency. And obviously to try and make sure that time's well spent. Most of us volunteer for what we do and don't want to be wasting our time. So figure out how we make the most of that and maximize our impact. And specifically, it said in the write up to this, which I've based the talk off, for local voluntary groups, because that is a real key obstacle as well, is just general capacity for people. So I'm going to run through a bit of that later and how we managed to get a bit of success with that. Certainly not claiming I've got all the answers in here, but just giving you some experience of what we've done to try and advance our objectives. So to run through some of the difficulties, some of the challenges first. First one is obviously public perception issues. So you've probably seen this graph before, but this basically shows what people picked as their top 3 ways to tackle climate change. And you can see one of the like gaping problems here is that 49% of people who were asked ranked recycling as in the top 3 ways to tackle climate change, and it actually ranks as 60th. So it's certainly not that recycling isn't important, both in terms of impact and in terms of getting people engaged, but it is way down in the list of actual impact, whereas only 15% rated getting rid of your car in the top 3, and actually that's the first. So we've got these perception issues to deal with, which is a bit of a challenge. And then we've got a lot of the issues with specifically uptake of low carbon measures. So any of these things I'm going to go through in a little bit, but people being busy or having bigger day-to-day issues, a lack of trust, not seeing what's in it for them personally, or really understanding what the risk is and not really getting the point of some of the technology. Now, these are like genuine barriers that a lot of people have, but ultimately, I feel a lot of how we deal with this can be tackled through how we actually frame some of the projects and what we're trying to do to bring people in when these barriers are completely genuine, but there are different ways we can employ a few little ways of thinking about it to try and get around some of those barriers. And then on top of that, we got blockers like lots of us will just put a message out on social media and expect that a load of people will come along. But obviously, social media these days is a bit of a hellhole. It's, you've never got any chance of putting a post up and suddenly convincing somebody who wasn't bought in already. It's just unfortunately doesn't work. Everything's so divided on there. So it isn't a great option for that. And often we don't really know how to try and reach out or do comms past that. The lack of trust, which I mentioned, between councils who write policies and have a lot of the power, and community groups who deliver the action. And that is a real big barrier to try and tackle. And the fact that a lot of installers just aren't even offering some of the options, some of the low tech options, and that might just be because they are not particularly aware about it, might be because they don't properly understand it, they think they're going to lose traditional business, whatever it is. So we've got all of those things to deal with as well. So the question that was posed for this evening is, how can we as local energy groups change perceptions on home energy solutions to help speed up the low carbon transition? And this is obviously a problem. You can look at that graph that's on this slide. So I'm just trying to move my face out of the way here. So this graph at the bottom shows uptake of heat pumps per 100,000 people. And you can see down here how far behind we're lagging. The UK is only above Hungary in this graph. So we're way off the pace in terms of this. And there's a lot of challenges, again, that come with some of this. So figuring out how you actually sell some of this technology, it's sell in the metaphorical sense, convince people that they should be getting involved. All the myths that I just mentioned, and which we'll go into in a bit, the fact that loads of us have got a ton going on, especially when we're all volunteers, not really grasping how to engage residents that aren't already part of what you might call the usual suspects or climate bubble. And as a result, all of that feels kind of like there's just a lot of apathy around. A lot of the time here are people in my area just don't care about this thing. And actually, I think that is not true at all. I think a lot of people do. We're just not necessarily engaging them in the way that is important to them, so they don't really get what the benefits are for them. And it's made to feel particularly worse when obviously those of us who work in this area a lot of the time realise the severity and extent of the climate crisis, ecological breakdown. So when it seems like apathy and it seems like how can you not be worried about this, it makes it even worse, and we end up getting really frustrated. So I'm going to try and tackle all of those things that we just mentioned with a very quick run through on these problems. So I am just going to blast through these just to demonstrate, what people might come up with. I'm going to try and attempt to bring it all together at the end with some work through examples to demonstrate how you can cut through some of this. So the first one, that people are busy, that's, completely fair argument to make, but also people always make time for stuff that will personally benefit them. So maybe it's just that they don't want to talk to us because we might be approaching them in the wrong way at the wrong time of day. It might be the wrong sort of person approaching them, someone that they don't particularly want to engage with, and whether we're actually saying anything that they care about. So these are all important questions to be asking yourself when you're trying to speak to people about the various energy efficiency, retrofit, generation projects you've got going on. So they got bigger things on their plate than climate change. This is, again, probably true. Lots of people have a lot of day-to-day issues. We had the chair of Surrey Charities in the other day, and he was saying that a lot of charities don't even put climate change in the top 10 of concerns that their members are dealing with. It's absolutely fair when they've got a lot of other things going on. But ultimately, what we need to do is start reframing this to show that it's a problem that impacts literally every walk of life, especially in the coming 10, 20, 30 years. So although it may be true, whatever their more pressing concerns are can still be couched in terms of the benefits of retrofit. So if their benefit is cost of living, and you've got to know what their concerns are as well, which is part of the point of this, is that the in-person engagement, especially listening, is crucial. So if it's cost of living, obviously energy efficiency could massively help with cost of living by cutting their bills. If it's health or pressure on health services, damp and cold homes cause condensation and mold, means more illness, means more pressure on local health services. And if it's the economy or jobs, well, there's 300,000 homes in Surrey which are rated EPC D or below, or don't have an EPC at all. They all need retrofitting. We don't have enough retrofit coordinators. We don't have enough installers. So there are a load of jobs available as part of a massively growing potential sector here, which really can help boost the economy. So it's local economy. So it's how we really get to grips with selling some of these co-benefits in a way that resonates with people. But again, you've got to know what someone's actual concern is. Trust and transparency, another really common concern. So in Surrey, when we let's take Hug 2, for example. Hug 2 is the home upgrade grant, the second wave of it. The funding for that comes from DESNZ, so government level, to Greater South East Energy Hub, to Surrey County Council. We then give it to a delivery agent, Action Surrey, who are owned by Woking Borough Council. Sorry, no, who are owned, I've got it wrong myself now, owned by Thamesway, who are owned by Woking Borough Council. So just on that one group, there's 7 organisations involved. And that gets residents confused. They don't really understand what's going on, who can be trusted there. They don't know a lot of the names of the organisations or acronyms involved. And on top of that, a lot of scammers come out the woodwork. So as soon as a grant comes out, the most vulnerable people are often getting phone calls saying, we're working for whatever your local council is or someone else they've not heard of, telling them that they can get money off if they contribute a certain amount of money. So this is a real blocker to a lot of people, especially the most vulnerable, who would benefit the most from some of this retrofit. And in the bottom right here, I've got a little quote from something called the Leaky Pipeline Report. So a chap called Tom Roberts, Dr. Tom Roberts, he's the co-director of the Institute for Sustainability at the Uni of Surrey. He did a whole research project on why people drop out of the grant funding process, and he found a lot of really interesting things. Two of the main things that came out of it were on trust, and one of those were that people really like to see your tier one authority, so you're probably your county council or your unitary, if that's what the setup you've got there is, on grants, on advertisements, etc., because they really feel that instills trust. And the second one, that people on the ground, so community hubs, if you will, be that a physical community hub like we run as Zero in Guildford, or a metaphorical one, which could be an Energy Champions project, doesn't need a physical home, but they can make a huge difference in helping break down some of the myths and lack of trust on the ground if they can get out and about into the community well. So two really interesting things that came out of that, and I can I'm sure you won't mind me sharing it, but I can probably share that report with you afterwards, Jeff, if people are interested in seeing it, because it is interesting. There's some interesting
Yeah,
stuff.
yeah, that'd be great. We could link to it in the write up that Talia will be doing.
Yeah, no worries. He also, if anybody is doing grant stuff, I'm sure Tom would be happy to come and talk to it. There's a full academic report on it. Then there's some slides which are a bit easier, and if you actually get Tom to come and talk it through, it's like even more simple. So I'm sure we'd probably be happy to do that at some point. But I'm sure I can share the slides. Um, Next one is what's in it for me, right? And I'm going to take a little interlude after this, but this is really key. And a lot of us do make decisions based on identity. We might not be doing that consciously, and we might not necessarily be doing it selfishly, but it's a huge part of what we do. And we often think that we can drive behavior change, just by saying something and what the benefit is, for example. But actually, if it doesn't resonate with how somebody identifies in their general life anyway, it's pretty much falling on deaf ears. And I think we're all really guilty of doing this, have been doing it for years. I certainly have been. And then getting again frustrated when it feels like apathy coming back. And there are some real crucial tips you can make to try and get around some of this. So everything on the right here is taken from various studies, but are some of the absolute no-nos in terms of how what just immediately turns people off. So, for example, even the words green and save the planet, for people who don't identify as an environmentalist, they pretty much immediately stop paying attention after that, because it's just, it's not how they identify. Same with anything themed eco, whatever. I put an X there, but eco, whatever. Jargon like net zero, DESNES, I've already said. No one wants to feel stupid. And if someone's, giving them a load of acronyms, which working in local councils, I'm absolutely guilty of all the time. I don't know what everybody else is like it with. Sorry, COVID's getting to me. Don't know how everybody else is, but I'm really guilty of putting out acronyms and expecting other people know what they are without even really thinking about it. So keeping things really simple, and then particularly I mentioned, the overwhelm of the situation. Doom and gloom is like a proven demotivator. People start getting stuck back in this cycle of thinking, well, I'm just one person. What can I do about it? Or maybe they've got, I just said not to say eco words, but eco anxiety, climate anxiety, whatever it might be. So there's lots of reasons we get overwhelmed. What is important is to try and shift away to some absolute keys. So, firstly, I've already mentioned it twice, I think, but listening to people, particularly in person conversations, and working on the values that they care about. So, what you might call shared values, to create this sort of shared narrative. And I'm going to come back to that in a little bit, because it's a really important part of how I think is a good suggestion for people to move forward. And then to look at hyper local action as part of a wider plan, because everybody cares, selfishly or not, about what's going on immediately around them. And if you can frame it as really local on the ground action to improve their local community, but as part of a bigger framework, you help sort of have your cake and eat it, really, because you appeal to different personality types. So those are just a few little tricks in terms of when people aren't really seeing the benefits for them, why they might not be identifying with what you're saying. So I'm going to take a little interlude here. I'm not going to go into this very much, but just in the middle of these barriers, I just wanted to talk about something which I did in the last knowledge sharing session that I did for SECA. There's a video of it, I think, so you can watch it. I'm not going to go into it a lot here. But this is a really key function of, I think, why we've managed to do all right with the things that we've been doing in Guildford. It's called Britain Talks Climate. It was a study run by Climate Outreach, More in Common, and YouGov. Started about 5 years ago, and they've updated it twice, once during COVID, once this year. Nearly 10,500 British adults asked 46 questions, including stuff about the economy, society, but with some golden questions in there, 14 or 15 golden questions about climate. So what they did there is that instead of what we traditionally think of as, us existing in a bit of a left-right binary in terms of attitudes towards stuff, because that's sort of rammed down our throats most days in terms of our political system. They actually found there's 7 different persona types, all who have quite distinct views about climate change, what the impacts are, how to challenge it, how to tackle it, etc. Now, some people may well fall into more than one of these, but this is a real game changer in terms of how you think about actually engaging people. And to show you an example of why so often messaging falls flat with people, if we take an example like a personal environmental choice. So let's say you should replace your gas boiler with a heat pump because it will reduce residential emissions and help tackle climate change, right? That would be a good example of this. If you think about this thick green bar as the left-right political spectrum, and these are roughly where the personality types sit along the spectrum. It's not exact, like these guys, for example, would skew left socially but right economically, but this is representation. If we were to use that messaging, get rid of your gas boiler, get a heat pump to tackle climate change, what we would find is that we would engage these guys, what Britain Talks Climate calls progressive activists, because they really care about climate change, so it would resonate with them. And it would engage what they call established liberals, because typically they're wealthier. Lots of these guys in the southeast, they're wealthier. They can see the benefits of investing for long-term cost savings in energy technology, and it's much lower risk for them than some other groups because if you get 7.5 grand from the boiler upgrade scheme, chipping in the extra 5 to 6 grand is a much smaller risk than someone who may only have less than 5 grand in their bank. So both these groups would be engaged, but you would have fairly strongly alienated the dark blue, what they call backbone conservatives, and the orange, the disengaged traditionalists. And these two actually make up 33% of the persona types nationally. So you've actually alienated a bigger percentage than what you've engaged, and you've not landed on 3 of the types, which make up about 40% of everybody else through different barriers, like maybe they can't afford a heat pump, maybe they have got some of the other problems that we mentioned before. But what makes this much worse, other than alienating a third, engaging a quarter, and not landing with anyone else in the middle, is that this 25% of people on the screen that you have engaged are probably the ones who are already doing the behavior change that you're trying to drive. So you're actually only really impacting a pretty small percent, 5 to 10% of people who would actually still be able to make that change because they haven't done it before, because that's because of their identity, they're motivated to do it. So this is a really key important point in when you think about how you design projects, bearing in mind the question poses, how do we bring the public along? Well, this is the absolute crux of it. It's how do we frame all of this in a way that doesn't just resonate with us, but that we actually put perhaps our own, motivating factors on the back burner to bring in a much wider array of people to actually start doing the behavior change that we need. And then in terms of this, so if what you're looking at here is called the diffusion of innovation graph. So this is to come back to, well, is it risky? I don't want to be a guinea pig for technology. This is actually used for the uptake of technology across society, but I quite often reference it because I feel it's a really good example of how we behave socially anyway. We're really social creatures. And this is a great example of what we do. So if you thought about an iPhone, a new iPhone coming out, for example, these guys here, the innovators, they'll be the people camping outside an Apple store for 3 days to get the new iPhone. These guys, early adopters, probably going to have it on pre-order. They're going to get it the first day it comes out. They're not going to camp out. Everyone in the early majority, they're probably not going to necessarily run out and buy this phone because they don't know what it's like. They're going to need more convincing, see some of the benefits. But eventually, the work of these two, innovators and early adopters, is going to bring these guys along so that they actually think that does look pretty good. Maybe I'll get involved with this. And at that point, the late majority just starts following because, as I said, we're social creatures. Nobody wants to be left behind. Now, a great example of this, to go back to Uni of Surrey, is how much we seek to be close to the norm, right? So they ran a behaviour change study, and they went out to however many students on campus, and they told everybody the average showering time is 7 minutes. And what they found was everybody who was showering for longer than that brought their showering time down much closer to the mean. So it shows that this actually can really impact. But what's interesting is that everybody who was showering for less than 7 minutes started increasing their showering times. So it was even less about the fact that they were already saving money and more the fact they decided that they were just going to be close to the norm. So that really demonstrates, I think, how much we all subconsciously, inherently, whatever, are just trying to level out as part of the norm, try and be part of the tribe or what have you. Now, within environmental stuff, what has always been the case is that we've never managed to get past this little bit here, which is called known as the chasm. So jumping this part is extremely difficult. And the reason is partly because of the messaging and the framing that I've discussed so far. We often just test what we're saying in little peer groups, and we never think about actually there's these other, 6 or 7 personas, 5 or 6 personas. How are we going to engage them? So we typically create environmental messaging to suit these two, and we never actually bring the early majority along. So this is another key part in that these guys, the early majority, if we're going to start driving mass uptake of retrofit equipment and technology, we need to figure out how to bring these guys along quickly. And a big part of that is they are more risk averse and they need to have specific concerns and risks addressed. And one of the best ways to do that is to find trusted messengers who they identify with, because we make so many decisions based on identity, from one of these two groups. That is a really important part because then they feel it much easier to transition to whatever this new behavior that we're saying is, and will have basically just dragged the late majority along. And you can see, I'm not going to go into this in too much detail, but there's lots of good examples of this, especially in terms of, how far we've moved on in the last 30 years in terms of normalizing certain types of technology or what have you. So that's a really good example of risk. And then around myths, obviously a lot of these still exist. So I don't know about you guys in energy projects, but we still get, oh, well, doesn't cavity wall insulation give you damp? That is hanging around from like 40 years ago. There's very few scenarios where cavity wall insulation will actually give you damp. If you're very exposed or you've got wind-driven rain hitting your property, then you shouldn't really necessarily have it installed. But this still persists, even though most houses in Surrey would be absolutely fine with cavity wall insulation. So getting people who engage fully briefed on these myths is really important, but you've got to fully understand the picture and be quite honest about it. Because also one of the problems in Surrey is we do have some homes built with cavity walls, but before the 1920s, which isn't that common. But the problem with it is they use the old type of wall ties, which if you ever look in a cavity wall, I was in the building trade for 15 years, so I've seen plenty of them, and I live in one of these homes with these old wall ties as well. They can rust and they actually can let damp come through. So it is important that people who are engaging on a lot of these things are really clued up on some of the myths and how to tackle them. And a big one in terms of uptake of technology is heat pumps. Like there's so many myths circulating about heat pumps at the moment that they don't work in cold weather. You saw the graph where we're the second lowest. The top one was Norway. Norway is clearly colder than the UK, but they were top of the graph. I can't remember what the numbers are off the top of my head. So there's a lot of the myths that persist, not a lot of myths that persist, and it's really key to be able to tackle some of these. And I really recommend putting a pool of information together of how your people who are going out to engage can do this. This is a great one that I've put in here. So this is how satisfied people are as heating system owners with different types of heating systems. And you can see that heat pumps actually have the highest customer satisfaction of all, higher than oil and gas boilers. But what I find most impressive about this is that obviously anyone with an oil or gas boiler has probably never had anything else to compare it to. So they're just sort of plodding along, as it were. But I would say that probably most people with a heat pump have probably had oil or gas before. So they are clearly rating their satisfaction as, compared to an old oil or gas boiler. So I think this is a really strong selling point for this. And there are loads of other good heat pump stats that you can look at for satisfaction. So it's a good way to start dispelling myths. Same thing about EVs here. Obviously, EVs are not a magic solution to anything. They've got a lot of, especially environmental problems associated with them, but they do unfortunately need to be part of a transition at the speed that we need to decarbonize to avoid 2 degrees warming above pre-industrial levels. So when people start giving a lot of myths about EVs, especially on their performance, this is another really good table to look at. Actually, it's about 20% higher customer satisfaction for all these factors combined for EV drivers than for petrol and diesel drivers. Another one is they always set fire. That is not true, or that they set fire to houses. Surrey Fire and Rescue have chatted to us about this. They set fire less often than a normal car, but if they do set fire, it's way harder to deal with, is actually the issue. So again, it's important to be nuanced in these conversations. We're not just trying to cover up the fact that lithium batteries can set fire. They do. You might have seen pictures of lithium batteries on planes sending the whole plane up. Transparency and honesty, but framing it around, well, actually, that's not really the problem. This is a problem, but it happens much less often, is really key to building people's trust in a lot of these things. So if you can find anyone from your local fire service, for example, that can back up any stats like that, really useful way to start going about training people up to talk about some of your projects. So those are some of those barriers. What I'm going to try and do now is try and bring all of this together, because we haven't really discussed a lot of solutions for that. But what I want to try and do is present it all as one solution in terms of a messaging package of how you actually go around driving behavior change, which is quite complicated, in some really simple steps. And again, I want to emphasize behavior change doesn't magically just happen, right? We can't just post something on social media, tell people to do X, Y, or Z, and they're going to go off and do it. Firstly, they've got to be able to do it. They've got to be able to get around all the barriers. And secondly, there needs to be investment in stuff for them to actually be able to do it. So this is why transport is such a tricky one to get people out doing more journeys. Might be different where some of you guys are, but around Surrey, the number one thing we always hear is people just don't feel safe on the roads, on their bikes, cycling on a bike, which is completely fair. I wouldn't let my kids cycle on the main road here. It's just not safe. So telling people, however much you tell people what the benefits are of getting on their bike, if they don't feel safe, they're not going to do it, right? But thankfully, one of the upsides of home energy is there is some investment in it at least. So a lot of people who would be struggling with fuel poverty will be eligible for retrofitting their house. So we know that there is some way to unblocking some of the obstacles through Hug, or LAD4 will be out in the next couple of weeks, the local authority delivery scheme. Boiler upgrade scheme for people who can afford the other half of the boiler, the other half of the heat pump, sorry. Eco 4 can be applied to social housing as well. So there are some mechanisms, even if it's not as good as it could be, to help actually drive the behaviour change. So I'm going to talk through our home energy advice task force, and again, I will emphasise I'm not pretending that we've absolutely got this cracked. But what we've done here is in this year, and only 88 of these have been done in the last few months while it's been warm, but we've supported over 600 homes in Surrey since the start of the year with thermal imaging surveys, written reports, and signposting to grants that they'll probably be eligible for. The service has got a 4.9 star out of 5 rating, and it's gone down really, really well. But what's happened here is we've run a little pilot, and then when the local energy advice demonstrator grant came out through DESNZ and then the hub, Great South East Energy Hub, which will be the same for all of us, apart from Ruth, I think it was, who's up in Cheshire. Yours would be the Northwest Net Zero Hub. We teamed up and we've created this project, a lead project, whereby Surrey County Council run one half of it, and they've built a one-stop shop, which I believe will be advertised from tomorrow. It's been a year in the making. It's been very slow. And in the meantime, we've been running the Home Energy Advice Task Force. So this is where we've been going out and helping people. And I've put this here just cheekily, local, mainly voluntary group, because I'm going to come back to this, because this is one of the big challenges of there's lots of us that are volunteers. But what I'm going to wrap up with is demonstrating how we've built from being a local, completely voluntary group with £1,250 donation into having 6 employees and £500,000 to work on retrofit and other stuff. So as I go through this, I'm trying to demonstrate that it is very much doable if you can get some of the framing and messaging right, and work with key partners along the way. So in terms of apathy, this is the motivations people have been ranking when they request a survey. So we've had 7, this was in March. At this point, we'd had 767 responses. Haven't updated it, I'm afraid. But you can see that the second biggest motivator, a third of all people are rating cutting carbon emissions as their main motivator for this. So that is pretty high. So I think that backs up that it isn't not everybody is totally apathetic to the problems we face. And actually, we've got a study from 2022 that we ran through work with the Britain Talks climate questions, specifically for Surrey district and boroughs. And 68% of the residents polled in that, of well over 1,000, said that tackling climate change and environmental issues is either extremely or very important. So clearly, the majority of people want action. They just don't necessarily know how to go about doing it. And importantly, only 5% of people said it wasn't important. So they really are a minority, the people who say it's not important. I said that we got 4.9 star rating out of 5, but the most important stat from this is that from all of those people who have had surveys, over 600, from the responses we've got, over 70% of people have said they'd be more likely to install significant retrofit measures as a point of the home energy visit. So I realise, it might feel occasionally like what you're doing may not be having as much impact as you might as you might want. And sometimes we're just sending people off into a bit of a black hole saying, apply for this or look at that. And that is still definitely a problem. But those people are motivated and you are helping them with whatever the project is. So it is completing these pathways so that we get more touch points so that people can keep progressing them along this pathway is a really key point, which we can come back to in a bit. So the first thing I want to talk about in terms of setting this up is how people actually find your project, because it's really important there's consistency through that, what the message is to start with, who is delivering the message. So if we took an example, right, let's say you were trying to get people signed up to a green skills course to retrain heating engineers to install heat pumps, right? If you went and you put an advert on Checkatrade and you went and put posters in, let's say, I don't know, your local pool hall or something, and it sent them to a web page, which was your website. If that page, if the first thing that they land on when they see that is, let's say, cope with eco anxiety or come and watch this play about saving the planet, for example, that is not going to resonate with the message that they saw to start with. That is not consistent, right? So almost all of them are just going to switch off straight away. If what you've got is just buried lower down as an event, it's not going to work. So it's got to be consistent with what they've seen, why they actually came there, rather than buried. It's got to be front and center of where they got to. The next thing before you start is to think about where can you get some of the statistics to show social norming, normative appeals. And I'm going to come back to what this is in a moment, because I know I said don't use jargon before, but this is just what the terms are called. So I'm going to explain them. But effectively, this is a behavior change sort of trait in all of us, where we sort of comply to the norm or what have you. As much as we like to think of ourselves as individuals, if we know 2,000 other people in our local area are doing something, we're way more likely to be like, hang on, why am I not doing that? I'll check it out. And then who's delivering the message? So it's got to be someone appropriate. So again, if you're trying to get plumbers to train up on a heat pump course, who delivers that message is really important. And ideally, obviously, that should be another person who's already done that course, who was a plumber, for example, and who can talk about it. There's no point having, I don't know, someone completely irrelevant talking about it, because it just won't land as well. So don't worry too much about the terminology. The point of this is not for you to go away suddenly knowing all of this. This is a long and fairly complicated process, but one that I really, really believe is worth trying to figure out in the long run. So this is when we start designing how you're talking about your projects, how you're engaging people. These are the things, ideally all 6 of them, that you need to be thinking about when you're doing that, so that you can bring the public along with you. So firstly, and I will come back to this, but is a shared destiny narrative. And that needs to be tailored to the people, ideally, if you can figure out, if you can go back and look at these Britain Talk climate segments, who you're trying to talk to. Now, there's 4 of them that are sort of loosely termed the persuadables, who are the most likely to want to act on climate change and have the capability to act on climate change, which are 2 of the most important parts of behavior change. It's called a COM-B model: capability, motivation, and then they need the O, opportunity. Meeting those 2, capability and motivation, is key. And there are four main personas in those 7 persona types to focus on. Well, that's in the other video. I'm not going to get bogged down with that. So your main message should not necessarily be climate change. It should be a shared destiny narrative, right? And as I say, I'll come back to that. Then your secondary messaging should be around co-benefit. So this is things like energy security, green jobs, holding unaccountable corporations, Shell, BP, etc., to account. Those are secondary co-benefit messages. People agree with them well in polling, but they don't necessarily drive behavior change. So it's important that you don't necessarily lead with those as well. Descriptive norms, which is X number of people are already doing this, get involved, as I said. Who delivers it? Your trusted messenger. And then your calls to action, which need to be really specific and ideally already be as barrier-free as possible. So as I said, there's no point saying just get out on your bike and go cycling if the roads aren't safe. There's got to be a clear pathway through. So focusing on calls to action that you know people can actually complete right through to the goal that you want, which is ideally retrofitting their home or getting money to retrofit their home. And then continually escalating that through networks. So that won't mean a lot to you like that. So what I've done is I've worked this through as an actual example. The stuff on the left here is just the stuff that was on the right before. So looking at our Home Energy Advice Task Force, this is what all of this gibberish jargon on the left means in real life. So a shared destiny narrative, right, for our heat project, that is, we're training residents to help their neighbours and communities deal with the cost of living crisis, reduce their bills, and stay healthy by reducing damp and mold in their homes. Okay, so cost of living, as I mentioned before, and health are two great messages to focus on. Almost everybody cares about those two things. Almost everybody's impacted by it. So us training residents up as a local charity to help their neighbours and communities, that is we're all in this together. This is what we're doing at the local level, but as part of a bigger picture. Okay, so that's what we lead with as the main thing. Our co-benefits within our Home Energy Advice Task Force are upskilling residents and creating jobs. So we've employed 3 or 4 people through the Home Energy Advice Task Force as coordinators across Surrey. We've trained 86 energy champions. We've trained up 3 people as retrofit assessors, 1 retrofit coordinator. So that's a great co-benefit which goes along with it. And we are part of a wider effort to reduce Surrey's residential emissions. Now, obviously, for us, that is our main motivator. We're really doing this because we want to reduce emissions. We want to tackle climate change. But it isn't everybody's motivator. So it isn't the thing we lead with. We put it in the co-benefits. It's important to have it in there because you want to make people make this connection between actually tackling climate change has a lot to do with health, the local economy, cost of living, etc. But we don't lead with it. Now, the descriptive norm, as an example here, that's what I said about the 600 homes. You might think, well, it doesn't really matter how many we've done, we just need more people. But it's really important that you use this to show people X number of people have already done this. Why aren't you involved as well? So we've supported over 600 homes in Surrey so far. Importantly here, for our fellow Surrey residents, so that's what you call a provincial norm. It's actually much more specific to the community. So where you can get it local to you, even better. It works even better. And I've got a slide to demonstrate that from a hotel study in a minute, if Jeff doesn't tell me I'm talking too slowly, which I think I might be. Trusted Messenger, we're an environmental charity. They resonate really well in the trust front on the Britain Talks climate stuff. But also, as I said, it's a partnership with Surrey County Council. I mentioned before the leaky pipeline slides. The local authority really does give legitimacy to stuff. And what we've done is we've made sure all web pages between the 2 organisations link back to each other, so people can immediately validate when they see our adverts. Actually, yeah, that is on the Surrey County website. It seems like it must be legit. Most importantly here, there's no better trusted messenger than word of mouth. Is peer-to-peer influence. People going out and saying, had these guys round, looked at my rooftop to put community solar on there, did an energy survey, whatever it is, best word of mouth you can get. And the call to action here is not just having the survey, it's what comes after it, because we don't want that to be the end of the process. We want the person to decarbonise their home. So it's either linking them up with funding or how they might become part of a bulk purchase scheme, whatever it might be. And then escalation is going to be completely dependent on who you've got locally. If you've got local councillors who can champion it, they can be really good messengers. Your local BBC Surrey was the best advert we got for this. We did a radio bulletin for them. They turned it into the front page story, the headline story on their front page. Got over 100 inquiries come from that in like 2 days. Your parish councils, local universities, your local diocese, if you've got one, all really key ways to escalate this. So I'm going to go quite quick, but just to emphasize about these provincial norms, you've probably all been to a hotel where you've seen something saying reuse your towel and save the environment or what have you. There's a couple of studies done in hotels which are really interesting, right? Bear in mind this happens in a hotel room, so it's behind closed doors. When they swapped the message from help save the environment by reusing your towel to a normative appeal, so join your fellow guests, that's the important part there, in helping to save the environment. Almost 75% of guests basically already did this. So people are then like, oh, right, well, yeah, I probably should do that if everybody else is doing it. That saw a 25% increase in the number of people, excuse me, reusing their towels. And then when they added a provincial norm, in this case, which is just the third one here, of guests who stay in this room, that is not even a very powerful provincial norm. But that saw an even bigger increase. So then a third of it increased by about 33, 34%. So it really can have an impact of us just trying to hit this social norm, even behind closed doors, which is important to what we're doing here, because a lot of the behavior change that we're trying to do happens behind closed doors, whether that be energy efficiency, turning down your stats, better insulating your home, whatever it might be. It all needs to happen behind closed doors. So the social norming is a hugely important part of this. And then in terms of a shared narrative, I said I'd come back to this, but I'm going to go through this quickly. This was a study done to test the Britain Talks climate messages. And what they did was they took 11 groups. These are 10 of them. And they all saw one different message or one different theme about whether the government should act on climate change. One just got a standard message, that was the control group. The other 10 saw each saw one of these different messages. Now you can see the highest ones, the highest increase in people who agreed with the statement that the government needs to act urgently, come from the shared destiny narratives. So climate impacts, impact on future generations, and impact on natural world. Right? Those have all the biggest, the statistically significant increases in people who agree. The other ones, like unaccountable corporations, leadership, energy security, people agree with them, but they have less of an influence on behaviour change outside of polling. So this was a sort of test as the Britain Talks climate stuff. And what's really important here is bringing local stuff in as well. So whenever we talk about this, we frame it firstly in terms of context. So that's flooding, fire, and train line infrastructure collapse in Surrey. I'm skirting through this very quickly because I've spoken too slowly. And then just lastly, quickly, the other obstacles we mentioned, social media, you just can't get away with just using social media and newsletters. In-person engagement is absolutely crucial. And I'm sure everybody's doing this already, but it's whether you're doing it in the best way you can, really listening to people, understanding their values and their barriers, and then working with those people to get stuff done so that you can find trusted messengers from unusual circles within there that then resonate with more of the non-usual suspects. Working with local authorities, really crucial part. Find someone inside one who can act as a bit of a cheerleader, make those connections for you. It's super important. Councillors and officers are not always the same. Remember, there's a lot of officers working hard in the council. If you can find one who can start working with you, it can make a huge difference to how impactful you are. And how you demonstrate you can actually work with major stakeholders is really key. So, for example, we do a lot with the Diocese of Guildford. The person who runs their decarbonisation programme also looks after decarbonisation for Winchester Diocese and Portsmouth Diocese. So if you're in one of those and you want to start trying to work with them, for example, I can link you up, and that's good proof of delivery if you guys can get a working relationship going and do some good things. And then in terms of installers, obviously a key there is to make sure that they don't feel like we're trying to undermine what they do as a living, that actually, look, this is about increasing job opportunities for you, linking them up with green skills courses, building a bit of a trust relationship. So all of this basically comes back down to trust and proving you can deliver. This is my last slide. Effectively, what I want to demonstrate here is Zero started out, as I said, with a donation of £1,250. We had about 15 people. This was only 4 years ago. And what we've done is we've worked through a lot of what I've said, partly accidentally, because we're in Guildford, it's fairly conservative voting. So we were trying to build a broad church, which, you know, got action on climate happening in a way that brought as many people in as possible. And then much more intentionally, once we discovered all the Britain Talks climate stuff. So we started off by building some partnerships. We realised there was a big gap in terms of engagement in Surrey, in terms of sustainability with businesses. So we worked with the University of Surrey and we got them to fund a contract, which was our first employee. And we showed that we could deliver that. That's the main thing. We hit all the KPIs in it. We set up some more successful pilots, which was one of the ones that led to our home energy advice task force. And that's what led to us being able to get our second and third employees through the local energy advice demonstrator bid. We then used some of this to show the good work we were doing, help drive some of that social contagion. We became a trusted messenger. And what we did then was we crowdfunded, and that's how we got our fourth employee. So we raised 40 grand for somebody to run Zero. And then we looked at wider issues. Well, okay, we're doing some things all right, but what could we be doing better? And obviously, one of the glaring issues is the lack of diversity in climate change and environment. So we identified a project, showed what we could deliver on things we'd done before, and we managed to get 350 grand grant to be able to do that and get our fifth and sixth employees. And we've actually got funding for 2 more people that we haven't employed yet. So we started off less than 4 years ago as a really tiny local community group. And we've grown to a charity that's run 2 town centre business hubs, raised £500,000 and have 6 employees, soon to be 7 and 8, hopefully. So it absolutely can be done. And don't get me wrong, a lot of people have put a lot of hard work into this, but how we framed it around this whole in-person engagement is absolutely key to what we've done. So I'm not going to go through this again, but what I realize that was a lot brought together because it's never going to just like click in one session. But what I wanted to do was just bring it back to this summary slide of when you design anything, all you really need to remember, if you don't remember anything else, is to take this little tick box away, take this slide away as a checklist, and look at everything that you're doing when you reach out to people, be it in a hub, a physical hub, online, in newsletters, when you're at events. be designing everything you say around these 6 key factors of driving behavior change, and it should hopefully make a big difference in how you actually manage to engage people. I'll stop there. I hope that made sense. I realize it was a lot of information at once,
Yeah.
but it's a really complicated topic to try and pull together. But distilling it into those 6 points is hopefully the easiest way to simply show, if you just do this, half the battle is kind of done, because at least you're aware of how you start addressing some of the issues here. I'll stop talking. I need to have a sip of water. Jeff, I'll pass to you.
Well, Ben, fantastic. I mean, I've not seen you perform when you haven't been ill. I'd like to be there sometime. That was really, really super clear. And in terms of talking too fast, for me, that was just perfect. And thanks so much for that. You really cracked it through very well. Please start putting some questions in the chat. Nicola's got one about heat pumps, but before I get on to that, I'm interested, Ben, in how your whole approach, how that's going down in your day job at Surrey County Council. Are you finding people your colleagues there and are kind of getting this, and they're allowing you to run with this, or is it? Do you feel like you're speaking a different language sometimes?
Mixed bag, a bit of both. So the biggest challenge that we have, obviously, is we have a corporate comms team at the council. And they're all comms professionals, but obviously how this is clearly very different. What I've just gone through there is very different to how you might just traditionally put out local authority news. It's, there's a lot more to it. And so no one likes being told how to do their job by someone who's new to the council or what have you. So we've got a good relationship with them, I think, but it's taken a while to try and demonstrate why we were trying to do what we were trying to do. And there's 6 of us in my team. It was just me when I started. So we've really managed to grow it because of being able to sell how important this is to. One of the big advantages here, I would say, is that our group manager is fantastic. My boss is also great. They've done a brilliant job of helping to spread what's going on. And one of the things that has made a big difference is Surrey's greener future is one of our 4 strategic priorities. So we've always got a bit of leverage to say, well, look, this is a strategic priority here. This is how we want to try and message on it. So it hasn't always been straightforward, but I've sat down and worked with lots of other groups across the council to try and help get some of this understanding across. And actually, it really translates well to some other areas as well. So we've run training sessions, for example, for the equality, diversity, inclusion groups in the council. We've managed to get our own comms working well, and the study that we did around Britain Talks climate, that was funded by the council. So we paid somebody to go out and do that in Surrey. It wasn't cheap because we had to pay a consultant to do it. But generally, I think it's really helped. People have taken to it well, and it really helps. We've got a good engagement strategy, basically. So framing it within that context, I think, has definitely made a difference.
Do you think that kind of partnership with Zero Carbon Guildford is helped by the fact you've got some full-time staffers on the Zero Carbon side, Guildford side, so they can see they're working with a more of a like for like arrangement? Because I've sensed a hesitancy with kind of local councils to get too kind of engaged with voluntary groups because they're almost like a different species.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. And I do think it is kind of a mixed bag. So obviously the advantage I had was, well, so I basically stopped. I come from, well, I've got quite a varied work history, but I stopped working to set up the charity during lockdown. And then I just completely ran out of money. So I was like, well, I need a job and I'm already doing all of this climate engagement for free. And then my other half sent me a message going that the council's got a job for someone who does engagement on climate change. So I was like, well, I'll apply. So I applied, and then they realized the job was too broad. So they split it into 2 jobs and offered me one. And now I basically look after the engagement team. So I manage 5 people within there. So it's obviously been massively helpful that I got the job and was managed to sort of work from the inside. So Surrey, the relationship with Surrey has been good. Guildford's been much slower, and we're based in Guildford. We've never managed to get a really great working relationship going with them. One of our representatives does sit on the climate change board for Guildford, but it's been a much different. They've just been slower as well. They got less money, obviously, as a tier 2 authority. So the blame's not all on them, but it's definitely a mixed bag in terms of how how the relationship works. And I think proving that you can deliver is a crucial step to doing that, especially if you can show with another big partner. So like the diocese or like a uni, we're really fortunate to have a great university on our doorstep. I think that's an absolute godsend. But it is really important to show you can deliver, to build that level of trust. Even then, it might still be like banging your head against the wall with some local authorities. I think I don't shy away from the fact that it can be difficult working with some of them. But if you can find that person on the inside that can sort of cheerlead for you, it can really make a huge difference.
Yeah. Yeah, great. Well, I saw some nodding of heads around for some of those challenges there. Nicola, would you like to kind of restate your heat pump question? You turned into a tree. Oh, that's good. Oh.
I'm multitasking, sorry. Thanks, Ben. Yeah, I really would like to know more about the story of the differences between air source and ground source heat pumps. And we're seeing that in Scandinavia. Do you know what they're mainly putting in there? And if you could just talk a little bit about the differences between the two.
I think it's a mixed bag. What in generally the terms of the difference between air source and ground source?
Yes, and is it that really ground source is better if you're starting from new builds, and it's costs more? Yeah, just to have a bit more kind of like an overview of when we're talking about heat pumps, really kind of having that clarity of the differences.
Yeah, okay. So I'm not an expert in heat pumps, but obviously in terms of new builds, I think ideally that a lot of them, if you're sensible now, putting in a ground source heat pump, so you've almost got like a district heat network for some of these, can be a really good step forward. So you can do that with multiple boreholes. But with ground source heat pumps, you either do a borehole or you can do it like much shallower, but you need a huge amount of land to do it shallower. So almost everybody does the boreholes, but the cost difference is massive, firstly. So with boiler upgrade scheme, that's BUS, you might have heard of that as a scheme, boiler upgrade scheme, you get £7,500 now, regardless of whether you install an air source or a ground source heat pump. But it probably costs you 10 to 12 grand for an air source heat pump, depending where you are in the country, but probably 30 grand for a ground source heat pump. So you have a massive extra contribution for a ground source heat pump. I don't know if you saw that article that came out a couple of weeks ago, but in terms of homes now that are being built new build, they are saving something like up to 80% of the residents' energy bills in the long term, 60 to 80%, I think it was. So the argument is clearly there in terms of cost of living and what it means for the resident. It's just that developers in the UK are not being held to it at all. So it's kind of madness at the moment over here, really. I don't know what the difference in terms of uptake between ground source and air sources in the Scandinavian countries, but I would assume that they probably have more ground source.
Did you know about the efficiency of both?
I don't know what the difference is, but I don't think that in the UK there's ever anything that you need to massively worry about in terms of efficiency. It has to get really cold for them to be like really inefficient. There's a great chap called Beanland who does talks for the Heat Pump Federation. He's the best technical person you can get on to talk heat pumps. If Jeff, if you're looking for a knowledge sharing session, I'm sure he'd be glad to come. He is excellent. He's a really good technical expert to speak to in it. But typically in the UK, it's not that much of an issue to worry about it. And if they've got that many in, Norway, I definitely think it's something.
I suppose one of the things I'm wondering about with the air source heat pump is, lots of moving parts. Are they going to have to be upgraded? How long are they going to last for? That kind of story as well, really.
Yeah, I mean, most boilers these days, if you think about normal gas boilers, it's a bit of a cliche to say they don't make them like they used to. But I'm a qualified plumber, so I used to go into a lot of houses, and you would see some boilers that have been in there 20 years ago, up until like they were being installed in the early 2000s, and then they potentially would only last 8 or 9 years. So it is true that they don't make them like they used to. But obviously, the time of the life term, of the heat pump, it is going to need replacement parts, but it's not going to be any worse than a traditional boiler.
Thanks.
Okay, I mean, that I did maybe a subject for a different talk, but thanks for that, both of you. Vaz, I think you had your hand up, and
Yes, my son lives in Norway. He's got a ground source heat pump. Most people in Norway actually have air-to-air heat pumps. This is what I'm told by him, because that's what they've done. They don't have wet systems like we do in this country. In this country, we've gone for air-to-water systems in the main, because a lot of us have got hot water system, central heating systems. And the reason a lot of them have gone for ground source heat pumps is because, of course, it's so much colder in Norway, and the efficiency, as we were saying earlier, goes down the colder the ambient temperature. And so, if you have a ground source heat pump, it means that the ambient source of the heat is higher than it is in the air, which means that you get a more efficient system being installed. But in this country, we don't get the sort of temperatures, which is why air systems are more prevalent than than ground source systems.
Sarah, you made a comment earlier about local authorities being really busy and overstretched. I wonder if you'd like to sort of elaborate on that, and because you've started. Well, tell us a bit about share a bit about your new role and what you're doing, because it's very relevant here.
Thanks, Jeff. So yes, I'm the climate change officer at South Downs National Park Authority, and having previously worked at I rejoined the national park in April this year, because this is a new post, and I previously worked at the national park for 7 years, but in various different roles, but not directly delivering on climate or environmental work. So I left the authority for 2.5 years. I worked at Basingstoke and Dean Borough Council as a climate change officer, and then joined Chichester District Council as an environment officer in their climate change team there, where I did a lot of work on retrofit, but not to the level that Ben has done in Guildford. So hats off to all your hard work, Ben. It's amazing. So I think my point there, in my role at the National Park now, is partly to deliver a funded project where we're working with One Planet to map all the climate strategies of the local authorities across the park and try to map all the actions and activity that's happening to see where are there commonalities and lots of work happening, and where are there gaps where there might be opportunities to work better and smarter together. But the other part of my role is to support community groups across the whole national park and try to help share best practice and encourage groups to work together in the hope that we can get some bigger, better projects coming forward for funding. But I think my experience of working in local authorities and working with lots of different local authorities as well, there's a lot of activists now working in local authorities trying to deliver on climate action. But they're often, I think local authorities are recruiting more people, but it varies across the different councils. And so you might have one person delivering in one council, you might have a team of 5 in another council. But where you've got 1 or 2 people delivering on climate change, it's a huge workload to take on. So they have to try and prioritise where they spend their time. And often it's very challenging, much as they might want to work more closely with local climate groups. It can be really difficult for them because they've got such a huge agenda to deliver. So yeah, anything that can help support councils to resource the work that needs to be done on climate change is helpful.
I think it's a really good point, and that's why they often end up looking like they're doing nothing, because that's all they can really do is focus on their 2030 targets of their own organizational emissions. So it might seem like they're not doing a lot, but actually they just can't really look at the broader picture. So it can be super frustrating. But yeah, I think at least, you know, their comms departments could definitely do more to support local community groups, and that's often a really good place to start, especially if you've got a lot of good initiatives that cover waste, cost of living, things like that. It really is hammering those different messages. But yeah, I think you're really right, Sarah. It's very difficult for some people. The chap in Guildford, like, I really feel for him. And our leisure centre is about 40% of their organisational emissions. It's so inefficient. but they're just stuck in this like spiral of not being able to decarbonize it because they might have to knock it down. So it's really tricky. It's, you know, yeah, it's not that people aren't trying necessarily, but if you can find a way to help them and you get someone in there, as I say, helping you to promote what you're doing, it can be a real game changer.
Thanks for that. Let me come back to an earlier comment from Robin. So lots of really useful experience, but I need it slower and more experiential. I'm feeling this is quite hard for me, this whole kind of you know, this whole new approach, rethinking approach. And Ben, I'm wondering, for kind of newbies in this, you've been working in developing this kind of new strategic thinking for quite a few years now. How do people get up this curve and get up this learning curve and apply this in their setting? How can we create a kind of a learning curve that works for people who are down the bottom still?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Well, so firstly, I think when we do engagement training for Zero, we get all of our new volunteers and we refresh existing volunteers as well to come and do engagement training, which is based on a lot of the principles that I've talked about this evening. One of the main things we do is we do active listening exercises. It is really difficult. You don't realize how often you don't listen to people and how many people are just waiting to speak. And like most of us are guilty of doing it from time to time. And when you're just waiting to speak, you miss all the clues that people might be giving you. So learning how to do that and actually listening to what people are saying is really key, but you need to know what the clues are. So I think that's a really good exercise to do. But what I would suggest is the first thing to do is to look at this Britain Talks climate study. They've got a great summary. They've made it way more simple than to look at the personas than the very brief run through I've given this evening. They give you a little breakdown of the sort of main motivators and values of those 7 different personas. And it's really interesting. What we do is we frame it into what we call catch-alls. So things like health, waste, finding local things that tie into that is a really good way to get started with this. So when we talk about transport, for example, what we'll do is instead of just saying, well, transport in Surrey accounts for 43% of all our emissions, what we usually train people to do is start talking about the transport issues, which for Guildford, where we're based, Guildford has the highest nitrogen dioxide air pollution levels of any stretch of road in the country. The bit of A3 that runs through the middle is the highest. It's like double the average at some points when it's peaking. So that is clearly one related to health, right? But what we add to that is that the local economy to Surrey loses £550 million every year just from people being sat in traffic. We're in the top 5 traffic hotspots in the whole of the UK, higher than almost every London borough. I think there's only 2 higher than us in London. And in Guildford, where we are, the north of the borough, above the A3, has something like an 8-year lower life expectancy, which is not just air pollution related. They've not got good access to fresh food up there. There's 2 areas in the top decile of food poverty up there. They've shut a lot of the GPs there. So there's a lot of social issues. But the point is, right, what we're not doing is saying everyone should get out their cars because 43% of our contribution to climate change is from transport. What we're doing is saying everybody driving and having more than one car, driving by themselves in cars, is having multiple impacts on our community, including a higher than average air pollution related death, more than even 1% of our neighbouring, more than 1% higher than our neighbouring counties, even though we've got some of the best healthcare in the UK in the southeast. It's harming our local economy from people being sat in traffic. And it's contributing to climate change. So we aren't just focusing on one thing. We're bringing all of these things in as a catch-all. It doesn't take that long to figure out some catch-alls for your own local area. So that's how I would suggest starting it. And the other thing I would suggest is I absolutely love all of this. I went down a full-on rabbit hole when I started doing it. So if you can find somebody who's really interested in like sociology, psychology, climate change, I'm by no means an expert in it. I'm just really interested in it. So if you can find somebody who's happy to spend some evenings of their life reading and digging into it, and then they can come back and summarize it for you. That's how we got to where we are now. And most of our volunteers hopefully have at least a decent understanding of how to talk about our own projects in a way that engages as many people as possible. Even if you threw them in at the deep end to do something around psychology, they probably wouldn't know where to start. They know how to talk about our projects, at least in a way that engages people. So that's a good starting point, I think. And I can send a link to the Britain Talks Climate Summary.
Yeah. Well, I think that sounds like really interesting advice. Any other hands going up before we wrap up? Mark, you got two fingers. Is there two questions there?
Early on, you were making the point that we can appeal to perhaps 25% and alienate a lot. And I think your messaging was saying how to appeal to a greater amount and alienate less. What's the most we can hope to, what's the least number we might alienate in the best approach? I guess we're always alienating somebody, if you know what I mean. Is 60% a good result, or?
I mean, if you can get 60% of people doing stuff to start with, almost everybody else would just follow. It's just the way it goes. So I think, yes, aim for 60%. That's great. I think the age-old adage, you can't please all the people all the time, is obviously very true. And this is especially the case with social media. It doesn't matter what you do on some social media, people will still attack. We've got something called Guildford Past and Present. You can literally pull a bag of drowning puppies out of the river in Guildford, post that you've done it, and people will still criticize you for doing it on Guildford Past and Present. So a lot of it is about that like in-person side of things coupled with the online things and approaching them slightly differently. What we say at work is that our engagement strategy is aiming for 100% engagement. Now that doesn't mean that 100% of people are going to agree with you, but it means you've offered everybody the opportunity to chime in, so that even with your biggest detractors for a particular scheme or project, if you've included them and they've told you why they aren't keen on something, they're hopefully less likely to derail whatever you're trying to do in the long run, because you will have consulted them all the way through, and hopefully they're less likely to, get their megaphone out and start saying, this is why we shouldn't be doing this, in a way that starts drumming up more public anger. So yes, you definitely never will get everybody on side. But as I said with the Surrey survey that we did, only 5% of people surveyed, I think it was 1,200 and something surveyed, said action on climate change was not important. So the number is pretty small. And when we ran the Surrey numbers, if you take out the two disengaged personas, so 2 of the 7, that number is 89% of the people who probably have the capability and motivation to act, which is extremely high because it's Surrey, right? So it's obviously a wealthy part of the country in a wealthy country. So it's not exactly the same as what it would be somewhere else where, people maybe didn't have as much free cash as in Surrey. But that is a huge number of people that you could potentially bring along. What we're not saying is we're just going to ignore the other 11%, because actually most of the policies and the co-benefits from the policies that would go into this, especially on retrofit, would help some of those people in the 2 disengaged brackets the most, because those actually are the 2 lowest income brackets as well. So we aren't saying we're going to ignore them, but what we're trying to focus on for rapid action to drive that diffusion of innovation graph is the ones with the biggest capability and motivation to act. So it will depend on your the specific breakdown locally, but if you go back to that wheel that I showed you of the percentages of the 7 personas, I think the 2 disengaged figures add up to about 28%. So you could reasonably say 70% of people are probably motivated and have the capability to act, are concerned about climate change. We're just not framing it in the right way. So I think 60 to 70%, if you were aiming to say, this is who we're trying to bring along, I think I am not pretending that is the levels of people that we're engaging. That's, I'm certainly not going to lie and saying we've got 60% of people in Surrey doing what we want to do. That's absolutely not the case. But this is a long process, and it isn't something to answer Jeff's question in a sort of roundabout way. None of this is something that you can learn overnight. It does take a long term, but I honestly believe it's worth it from the success we've had with Zero, building up, the funding, the number of employees, and how we've managed to start getting relationships going from the council to community groups. I do think it's worth the slog to try and do it.
Right. Well, I think that makes complete sense to me, at least. And I think let's let you off the hook now, Ben. It's been a really fascinating talk once again, and this speaks to me of a need for all of us to go back and do some thinking with our colleagues, and some talking and some listening, as you say, and to actually focus more on that rather than just the doing, because we have tended to focus nearly all of our work on the doing, which is because that is such a job in itself. So let me say thank you, and thank you everyone for taking part. It's been a really nice group. Talia is going to be putting together a blog based on tonight's talk, and we'll link to the slides when that's published. That's probably going to take a little while to come out. So if any of you is particularly keen to get the slides early, you can just email South East Climate Alliance and we can ping over a copy. I've taken the liberty, Ben, of putting your email address in the column here, but you're not exactly a kind of a hidden man, so they'd find it somehow.
Yeah, that's fine. I might not answer this week, to be honest. I'm probably going to go to bed today and for the
You
rest
might
of
have
the day
it.
and tomorrow, but I will answer.
If you'd like us to write you a sick note, we could crowdsource it. So if any of you who are not yet on the newsletter, SECA newsletter, please do sign up. It's on the website, South East Climate Alliance or seclimatealliance.uk. Just looking ahead, we've just fixed the date for our next annual face-to-face gathering. It's going to be in Guildford, just round the corner from the Zero Carbon Guildford office on Saturday, the 1st of February. And it's going to be, the shape of it is still coming together, but we're going to be looking, it's 2025 by then, halfway to 2030. So we'll be looking at how far we got in reaching our 2030 targets and what needs to be done to accelerate it. So a lot of this stuff we're talking about tonight will be dead relevant to that. So make an early note in your diaries, because it's these face-to-face gatherings are a really great way of cross-fertilizing. So on that note, let's thank you everyone once again. We'll stop recording and we'll say good night.